Welcome back. This is the first video for Chapter 4 for Industrial Organization. And we're going to talk about behavioral economics and how behavioral economics is important for industrial organization. So our traditional economic models, sort of starting in really the late 19th century, but through the 20th century, sort of assumed more and more rationality. All right. So Adam Smith, back in the 18th century, did not assume that people were rational. But what we found in economics was that it was much easier to model rational behavior because it was optimizing some function, right? So whether it was, utility maximization or, time preferences that were consistent, rational behavior made a lot of sense. And then starting in the 1970s and into the 1980s, the psychologists sort of pushed back, especially Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and said, that's really not how people behave. And so behavioral economics was born. And with behavioral economics, what we're trying to do is move away from how people sort of should behave as if they were optimizing something and thinking more about how people do behave. Now, the importance for industrial organization is that firms have always known that people are not fully rational, right? And firms have a big incentive to take advantage of that irrationality, right? Because they might be able to get people to buy things that they wouldn't buy, to spend more than they would otherwise spend. And if they're successful in doing that, then they can really increase their profits, right? And so we'll talk about sort of those pieces of behavioral economics and how it relates to industrial organization. So one of the interesting things that sort of has come about more recently, even than behavioral economics, is this idea of sort of neuroeconomics, where we're actually trying to figure out what's happening inside the brain when people are making economic decisions. And so the way we do that is by giving people sort of economic problems while they are in an fMRI machine, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so we can see sort of which parts of the brain are active while they are making different types of decisions. And this can sort of help us think about, which parts of the brain is being used when people are making more slow, careful, rational decisions versus which parts of the brain are being used when they are making, faster decisions, more emotional decisions than otherwise. So one of the issues, of course, is that people have limited amounts of time. They have limited attention. They have limited sort of cognitive ability, right? We're not all geniuses. And so the world is a very complex place. And so this complexity means that it may be rational to make shortcuts, really, right? To simplify reality and figure out, okay, well, even if I'm not getting this 100% right, I can make a much faster decision and get it 80% right or 90% right. And that's good enough for right now, right? And so we call this bounded rationality. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Especially, as we learn to make decisions, right? So if a very complex decision, like, buying a house or something, we may not get it, completely optimally right the first time. We'll learn more. We'll get it more right the second time, the third time. But hopefully that first time we can at least be close. In addition to complexity and just having, too much information, too much sort of need for calculation, there's also, some decision making is just unpleasant, right? And so sometimes we avoid making decisions. We avoid doing our economics homework, which sounds crazy. And so things like procrastination, right, can actually end up hurting us, but we still do them. And so, we want to think about times where people, might not behave rationally, when they might have habits that, interfere with the way they behave, when they might use heuristics, which are sort of shortcuts or rules of thumb that people use in order to make decisions, and then how that impacts firms' strategy, right? Because that's what we're really thinking about here in industrial organization. So one helpful way to think about this, which was popularized by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, is this dual systems approach. And so the idea of the dual systems is that we have system one, which is really sort of our quick decision making, and we'll use that in a lot of everyday decisions, versus system two, which is our sort of slow, deliberative reasoning when we really need to sit down. So you can think of system two as like, having a math problem, taking it step by step, coming up with the right answer. System one is just making a decision quickly. Now, one of the interesting things that Kahneman pointed out in his book was that the more we do something in system two, the more intuitive it becomes, and so the more we can use system one. So one of the examples he gives in the book is the idea of, someone who's played chess for a long time versus someone who's just learning, right? Someone who's just learning has to take sort of step by step and see all the different, possibilities, whereas someone who has a lot of experience with chess can look at the board and come up with a much better move, sort of right away. So that's really important, I think, because, it means that professionals, experts at things, even in complex things, are going to be able to make decisions much more quickly and accurately than amateurs. And it just shows the importance of learning and experience in all walks of life, but, in our case, in economic decision making. So if we think about this in terms of the fMRI pictures that we were talking about earlier, right, we see the frontal lobe is really active when people are using system two thinking. And so that's sort of the last part of the brain to develop. Whereas with system one thinking, right, it's much more about the limbic system and the reward pathways, which are, about emotion and pain and pleasure, and our sort of physical needs like hunger and thirst, and these things actually do sort of light up in the fMRI machines when people are making economic trades. And so I think this is one of the things that's important to understand when we think about sort of problematic behavior like gambling or trading, financial trading excessively, where people can lose a lot of money. But really it's because, this sort of limbic system is taking over their decision making. And so firms, as I said, have known this for a long time and are really take advantage of these things. And, they want to, associate their products with positive emotions. They want to, make sure that their product name is available to us when we're making our buying decisions. And so they're taking advantage of all these things that, mean that we're not making the best decisions that we could. And because they're taking advantage of them, it means we're making even worse decisions than we otherwise would be. And so when we're thinking about public policy, we want to think about, okay, well, how much do we want to, limit or regulate things like advertisements versus allowing firms to sort of freely advertise? And different countries have come up with, sort of different answers to that question, but it's a very important question when we're thinking about industrial organization. And so the other piece is the idea of salience, which is when something is sort of striking and memorable, right? So like if you've watched The Matrix, the woman in the red dress, right, is salient. The example they give here is a red sports car. And so this is another way that firms can take advantage of our sort of system one thinking of selling us something that is striking, that is memorable, popular, but might not actually be what we need. And so that's another way that firms will use this sort of less than rational thinking that we are all sort of subject to in order to increase their profits. So that's the end of the video, the first video here for chapter 4. The other thing I think is it's important to sort of remember these pieces of behavioral economics, especially as we move forward through the course, because we'll build these sort of mathematical models which feel very sort of divorced from reality sometimes. But we want to remember that, firms are actually making these decisions in the real world. And when we think about things like advertising, when we think about things like product design, pricing even, they can be taking advantage of some of these behavioral aspects that are less than fully rational.